Alexa off. Well, hey guys, Mrs. Shelton here. Gotta listen to music, gotta save my sanity while I'm home and talking to myself and lecturing to myself and not getting feedback from you guys. But that's what I am on here today to talk to you guys about is the rest of chapter 9. We are talking about the brain today. So this is chapter 9, section 13 is the main thing we're going to be addressing in this screencast, and making sure you understand the major parts of the brain and what their general functions are. And then we'll wrap up with the 914 and 915. So wrap up that chapter. And so you should be able to do then the finish your study guide, reading guide, the review questions, and then be able to take the test. So what you should have out is you should have out your reading guide in order to kind of follow along and make sure you understand what are the main parts and pieces that you need to know. So what we have here is a brain. So with this picture, this diagram is on your test. You definitely need to know this particular diagram and just the main parts of it. We're not asking you guys to know a whole lot of detail about the brain. However, the brain is amazingly complex. Your brain has over 100 billion neurons that make it up. I mean, so that's 10 to the 11th power. As far as number of neurons that are all communicating in here and working to make you you. I mean, this is who you are. You are your brain. And this is where your memories are, your emotional responses, your control of all the autonomic systems in your body. It's all happening here inside this brain. And what's remarkable really about studying the brain is most neurologists are going to fully admit that we probably know more about the universe and the cosmos than we know about your brain. There's so much that is unknown in this. So it's pretty remarkable. We do know a lot about the brain, but there's still so much more to uncover and to learn. Now, when we look at this picture, now the brain, when we take a look at this, there are 4 main parts of the brain that you have to know from this diagram. And these are highlighted here too. So first, biggest part here, this is the cerebrum. So your cerebrum, this is actually where a lot of your sensory, your motor functions are, your thought processes, your decision making. This is all happening here in the cerebrum. How we process sight and sound is all happening in the cerebrum. So all of this whole area in here, this is what we usually and generally think about with the brain. Now, there's this bottom part down here. This part down here, this is the cerebellum. So your cerebellum, this particular region of the brain is actually for coordination. What it's going to be doing, what it used to be thought of, is that it was actually going to be coordinating all of your muscle responses. I mean, if you think about something as simple as walking, I mean, there's just a whole bunch of muscles that have to be contracting and relaxing in order to ask for that action. Well, it's this cerebellum here that is actually coordinating that. Now, we've actually learned that this actually coordinates a lot of your mental thought up here. If you are problem solving, if you're seeing and doing, you actually have to be coordinating multiple regions of your cerebrum in order for having one precise thought. And this is also responsible for that coordination too. So it's not just coordination of muscle movement, it's actually coordination of all of your cerebral coordination too. Now, another region that we need to know about is this region here that is referred to as the diencephalon. So this diencephalon, um, it's what it's going to be doing is actually directing a lot of this sensory information to the right location. And so with that, it's pretty important. It's also, we'll talk more about the thalamus and hypothalamus in here too for maintaining homeostasis as well. But for the most part, for the diencephalon, I just need you guys to know right now that it's kind of function of directing that sensory information to the right location of the brain. Now, brain stem is the next area that you guys should know. Your brain stem actually has 3 parts: midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. So this brain stem area here, it's really some of your autonomic responses. It's really kind of your primitive brain that's located in here, and those processes that we'll be discussing as far as like your heart rate and your breathing rate and some of those things are actually controlled within this area here. But those are your 4 main regions of the brain. So your diagram, what you should also have on the diagram that I asked you guys to label is everything that's highlighted here. So you should actually have your cerebrum. You should have your diencephalon, your brainstem, your midbrain pons and medulla oblongata. That should be labeled. Your corpus callosum, we'll talk about this in just a little bit, but your corpus callosum is actually what allows your two hemispheres of your cerebrum to communicate. And so this kind of looks like somebody had their ear pressed up against there and made an ear print in your brain. But this is showing you this middle of the brain. But this is a connection that actually connects then the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain together. Now up here, when we think about the brain, we always kind of think of these ridges and these grooves that exist. In our textbook, they refer to them as convolutions and the sulci. Now, they're really hills and valleys. Now, why we have this and we have all of these folds that exist is to increase surface area. Because remember, in our last lecture, we talked about the meninges. The meninges are this pad. So that dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater, and then you also have a lot of cerebrospinal fluid that then is contained within here. Well, all that fluid bathes all these cells, and it's actually a way to make sure that nutrients and waste get in and out of these cells in a very, very rapid manner. So by increasing the folds, we're increasing surface area, and so we're actually then increasing the amount of nutrient and waste exchange. So your neurons can actually be getting the energy they need in order to be you and do the things that you need them to do, like watch me and listen to me. So the way your textbook then breaks it down is we're going to talk about each of those four main regions one by one. So as we move on, I can talk a little bit more. Oh, we're frozen here. Why is my computer frozen? Come on, buddy. It does not want to move. Yay for technical difficulties. We love them. So let's go here and see if we can just kind of use these pictures. So there aren't many pictures that we need to show you, but I do want to show you actually this one. There's your brain. So when we do look and we see what your brain looks like, so this is a real brain, and this is cut down the midline, and so it's cut at the corpus callosum, and then diencephalon is cut in half, and then also then the brainstem is cut in half. You can actually see just kind of the difference in structure of that cerebellum. Cerebellum kind of looks like a tree. When you look at kind of those branches, that white matter versus gray matter difference is there. And then you can also see the convolutions and the sulci very clearly up in the cerebrum too from this particular picture. Now, what you're not going to have to know is you are not going to have to know this region, but you should be familiar. When we talk about the frontal lobe, when we talk about the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, well, that should all be really familiar to you because we already learned those bones of the skull. And so that's also referencing these different regions. But this is just also kind of interesting too, where you think like your occipital lobe, what we do know is this is where your visual cortex is and where we process a lot of vision. Our understanding of words and things like that is happening up here in the parietal lobe. Our decision-making process up here in the frontal. Over here in the temporal, we've got our auditory, so for hearing as well. So this is also why it's really important in order to be able to direct that sensory information to the right location and process. I mean, actually, if you kind of think about it, there are some people who they actually smell sounds. Kind of cool. There's people who, sound to them actually is a visual color. So synesthesia is actually something, if you're interested in that, would be something to look up because it's pretty fascinating how the brain often works. Now, let's go back here. Now, let's talk about the cerebrum and some of the terms that you guys need to know directly about the cerebrum. So one of the terms you need to know is the cerebral hemispheres. So your cerebral hemispheres are the two halves of the cerebrum. You guys have seen me in class, take the brain, pull it apart, show you the halves. Your cerebrum fully has two halves that actually operate independently, except for their connection here. This corpus callosum now allows for information to go back and forth. So it really seems seamless in the way the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain are communicating with each other. There's the video that I linked there about somebody who had half a brain. Sometimes seizures in people are due to this miscommunication between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And so what they have actually found is that hemispherectomies in certain cases is actually going to help that person live a long, healthy life by removing one of the hemispheres. The other hemisphere is actually able to pick up where the other hemisphere was doing both jobs, but now it's just one hemisphere doing all the jobs all together. Now, we talked about the convolutions, we talked about the sulci, and then if we're talking though about the cerebral cortex, the cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the cerebrum. Now, the cerebral cortex is all gray matter, and being gray matter, that means it's not myelinated, and this is actually where the highest number of neurons exist in your brain. So that cerebral cortex, about 75% of your neurons actually exist in that gray matter. And then from that gray matter, they actually have axons that extend down into the white matter of the cerebrum too. But I need you guys to understand what that cerebral cortex is. It's that gray matter that's on the outside of the cerebrum. Now, another thing that exists in the cerebrum, remember I said these convolutions and sulci, there's cerebrospinal fluid that's actually bathing these cells. Well, what we can't see in this picture is there's actually lots of ventricles. So kind of these rivers and little lakes that exist inside the cerebrum too to get that cerebrospinal fluid flowing through and making sure that all of the neurons are getting plenty of fluid as well. So when you hear that term ventricle, the ventricles there are these cavities or spaces for the fluid to be flowing through and providing nutrients to all the neurons and neuroglial cells in your brain as well. So that's kind of the main parts of the cerebrum that you're going to need to know. Now, diencephalon, down in here. Now, the parts of the diencephalon that you need to be aware of are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, you would never have to identify where the thalamus and the hypothalamus are, hypothalamus being lower, hypo low. Now, the hypothalamus is the most important region of the diencephalon to be aware of what it does. Because your hypothalamus really is, it is the control center for homeostasis. When we talk about homeostasis, it is pretty much the hypothalamus that is constantly regulating what all of those set points and those normal parts of your body are. And then it's communicating directly with your nervous system or your endocrine system in order to then fix that as well. So your hypothalamus, just some of the things that you should have down that your hypothalamus are going to be controlling: body temperature, water balance, hunger, weight. A lot of hormones are regulated there. So kind of keep in mind just some of those functions that your diencephalon are going to be, and so within that diencephalon, what that hypothalamus in there is going to be regulating. So within that diencephalon, know the hypothalamus. That's the most important one to make sure that you are aware of. Now, when we get down to the brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, you should just know those general directions. But as far as separating out each of their jobs, the only one that I really need you to know is I need you guys to know this medulla oblongata. That medulla oblongata, this truly is like your vital functions. If you think about what you can't survive without, your medulla oblongata is controlling those. So, heart rate and breathing rate. Can't survive without being able to adjust those. Blood pressure also gets regulated here in this medulla oblongata area too. So really kind of think about those primitive things. Heart rate, breathing rate, blood pressure, those are the things that the medulla oblongata is controlling for you, is what is happening. Now, another region in here, it's not a specific region, but I do need you guys to understand that within the brainstem, there is another series of neurons here that's referred to as the reticular activating system. And that reticular activating system is super, super important for kind of slowing down some of these sensory impulses that come to your brain so you can sleep. So that reticular activating system, if it wasn't shutting down, I mean, it actually regulates, all the sensory information is still coming through there, but it's regulating what it allows your cerebrum to pay attention to and what it's going to say, nah, ignore it, nah, ignore it, no, ignore it. So when you're sleeping and something unusual is happening in your house or an unusual sound, usually then that reticular activating system will just go, yeah, wake up, buddy. This is something unusual that we need to be paying attention to. But if you also have sleep problems, sometimes it exists then in that reticular activating system too. It's not slowing down impulses, or you're now like hyper focusing on certain impulses too. But within that brainstem, know the medulla oblongata, and then make sure you know that reticular activating system. Medulla oblongata, you can identify its location. Reticular activating system, you're not going to be able to identify that one. Now, last but not least, we've got our cerebellum. Kind of looks like a walnut to me, but I also grew up out in the farm with lots of walnut trees. But this is our white matter in here when you actually take a look there, and we've got our gray matter on the outside. But again, this is all for coordination, that coordinated thought process and coordinated muscle as well. So this also sits down here at this base of the skull. And here again, if we actually look here at the bones, here's actually my medulla oblongata and the beginning of my spinal cord. What do you think might happen if your foramen magnum, this big hole in your skull, was too big? Well, sometimes this cerebellum can start kind of getting pinched off and kind of falling down into that space too, which leads to some coordination issues and problems. But recognize just what that main function is. And so identifying if somebody had damage to that, how would we know? Now, the rest of the chapter, kind of stuff we've already gone over. So there's really no new information that we need to be addressing. What they do talk about is we're addressing, again, making sure we understand that peripheral nervous system. So that's what 9.14 is talking about. And when we talk about the peripheral nervous system, remember that peripheral nervous system is going to be all that sensory and motor actions that are happening there. Remember, too, that if we're talking about our peripheral nervous system, this is going to be our spinal nerves. And let me just show you, too, cranial nerves. So spinal nerves being all of those nerves that extend out from the spinal cord. But if we actually look at our cranial nerves, on the bottom side of your brain, there's actually 12 pairs of nerves that extend out from your brain too, like your optic nerve and some other ones that when you take a college anatomy class, you will end up having to know all of those. You're going to need to know all of these 12, and you're going to need to know all 12 of their functions as well. So from this particular diagram. But for our purposes, just know what a spinal nerve is, know what a cranial nerve is, and know that when we talk about those are part of the peripheral nervous system, not part of the central nervous system anymore. Because remember, two parts of the central nervous system, brain, spinal cord. Now, last but not least, we are going to go back to, oh, actually, here's a cool picture. Here's actually all of your, so you can actually see all your spinal nerves that are extending out, and you can actually see then from just all these spinal nerves. This is actually what I get to experience right now is with all the computer work I'm doing. If we take a look up here at all of those nerves that are at C5 through T1 that are extending out through your vertebrae, all this computer work is actually kind of making me tense and tight, and I'm getting lots of pain shooting down because I'm not doing this enough and stretching and making sure that I am not pinching on those nerves. So get outside, do some exercises. Don't just sit at your computer all day for your body to be able to get all the information to and from in those areas as necessary. Now, last part of this particular chapter is going back up to our divisions of the nervous system again, and reminding you of those divisions of the nervous system, making sure we understand that breakdown. So from this, remember that we started with the difference between our central versus our peripheral nervous system, central nervous system being brain and spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system being your cranial and your spinal nerves. Now, remember, it's your peripheral nervous system that has many, many breakdowns. Now, your sensory division, that sensory division we don't break down any further. Your sensory division would include, more specifically, when we go to chapter 10, we'll talk about your sense of smell, your sense of sight, your sense of hearing. We'll talk about that sensory division, but it's really your motor division that has lots and lots of different smaller divisions that we need to be aware of. So we've already discussed within that motor division the somatic versus autonomic. And so when we talk somatic, remember that's what you have some control over. And so what we have some control over in that motor division is our skeletal muscles, but it's the autonomic division that's a lot more complex. The autonomic division, those are the things that happen automatically. So we don't have any control over those. So our smooth muscle, our glands, our cardiac muscle, those are things that are automatically controlled for us. But what we also have to make sure that we are aware of is that autonomic nervous system gets broken down one more time. It has two more subdivisions. And so those two subdivisions that I need you guys to know from the autonomic nervous system is your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. So your sympathetic and your parasympathetic divisions, they're antagonistic. And really, the simplest way to understand those is that we've got a sympathetic nervous system, that's our fight or flight response, that's going to excite and elevate different actions within your body. But if we're going to go up, we also have to be able to come down safely. And that's why we have a parasympathetic division too, that's going to also bring those organs and glands and muscles back to their normal state. So your sympathetic system brings you up. Your parasympathetic system, like a parachute, it's going to be bringing you back down safely. And so those are your divisions that we should be aware of also for the remainder of the test. So at this point, we have completed going over chapter 9. You should have the content necessary that you need to finish the reading guide. You've got your textbook, you've got my lecture, you also have my copy of the reading guide, my answers. Be able to then translate that into the review questions. And then once you're done with that, take the test, and chapter 9 is done. And then we'll move on to our next unit of learning while we're on homestay. So during this COVID-19 outbreak. So hopefully this helps some of you guys, and hope to talk to you guys soon. So with that, let me get logged out of here, and I will be saying adieu. Goodbye. Let's do this. Da-da-da.